Okay, so this morning, we're going to take a little tour to the city of Thyatira. Now, there's not a lot of pictures to show you. We'll just have to mostly talk about the city and the culture, but it's really one of the most amazing letters of the seven. It's the middle letter, so 3 on one side, 3 on the other. It's the longest letter that John writes in Revelation, and it's the smallest and weakest of the cities. Maybe John is up to something. John often loves to play with numbers. He likes symmetry in numbers. And of course, the number 7 is an important one. So you have 7 cities, and the middle letter, well, who knows? Maybe he was up to something. When it happened to be Thyatira, they get the longest letter, even though they're the smallest and weakest of the cities. We'll see. Okay, so Thyatira, quick geography just to orient our mind. You have the Mediterranean Sea, Athens, which is the capital of Greece, and of course Israel, where Jesus and the good news of God's reign begins, and it goes out, and when it goes out, it goes in this direction, and so much of, let's say, the book of Acts, if you read the book of Acts, happens in this area over here, what's called Asia Minor. And in particular, a lot of it is happening in a very small area of what we call Turkey today. And that's where our 7 churches lie. So if we go a little bit closer, this is the same thing we've seen each week. The 7 churches, John is headquartered there at Ephesus. He's writing, he's pastoring to these churches. And both the book of Revelation and the gospel that John wrote himself are very much connected with Asia, because that's where his audience first is. So I'll give you an example. Over by Laodicea and Colossae, you see those 2 pins at the bottom right of your screen. There's another city. Once we get to Laodicea, I'll show you this other city called Hierapolis. Well, Hierapolis is where the disciple Philip ended up living. Philip went there. He had 4 daughters. Some say 7 daughters, but at least 4. Well, what gospel mentions Philip the most? And it's the Gospel of John. So John, writing to his audience here in Asia, mentions Philip over and over and over. Well, why would that be? Well, because they know Phil. Phil lives right down the street in Hierapolis. Phil comes to all the conferences. He was one of Jesus's disciples. So it makes sense that John, as he's writing his gospel, is including names or emphasizing names of the people that they would be familiar with. Every year at the annual church conference, Phil shows up and speaks about something that he tells a story about Jesus. So it's very much that those little details to know about John and what's happening over here are very important. That's just one little side note. Anyways, so the letter of Revelation, chapter 1, to the churches of Asia, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, that's where we're going to go today, Sardis, Philadelphia, and of course Laodicea. And Laodicea includes the cities of Hierapolis and Colossae, which are right next to each other. Okay, so those are the 7 churches of Revelation. Now, if we go to Thyatira, as I just mentioned, it's the smallest by far of all the cities. The guesstimate, and it's a guesstimate, is 25,000 people, a population. So it's a small town. It's the weakest of the cities. Geographically, there's no Acropolis. Each of the other cities have something that give it some strength. And Thyatira is the exact opposite. It's placed right in the middle of a valley, and it was placed there, at least established by the kingdom of Pergamum as an outpost to try to stop invading armies. So what would happen is you have the armies from the east coming up this, oh, let me back up, sorry about that. you have the armies coming from the east, and there's two valleys. You have the Caicus River Valley. Caicus River is where Pergamum is. And then you have the Hermus River Valley. The Hermus River is where Sardis is. So those two valleys are connected. And when the armies would come from the east, they have to go through this valley, then turn north. If they're trying to get to Pergamum, they have to go right through Thyatira. So the idea was it's a military outpost placed right on the road that's there to stop an army from getting to Pergamum, because then the army is going to go down the Caicus River Valley to get to Pergamum. And scholars generally think that they saw themselves, the people at Thyatira, as the speed bump along the way. They knew they're not strong. They know that they're a weak city. And they know that if an invading army is coming, it's just a matter of time before they're going to get rolled over. But this becomes an important spot to try to defend the kingdom of Pergamum, even though there's nothing geographically that makes it strong. So Thyatira sits in a valley. It's about 4 to 5 miles are the closest mountains there to the east, your right hand. So right here would be the closest mountains. So again, nothing overwhelmingly strong about its position, and it's quite a small city. And today, basically, the ruins are just built over by a city. So I'll show you, this is one park that they have that's the largest park. And every direction you aim a camera looks exactly the same. There's stone walls, and there's columns and things laying on their side. They don't have a huge archaeological site like they do at Ephesus. The city is built right on top of it. They do find significant pieces from that time, just in random spots around town, or maybe people have reused a piece of stone that has some writing on it. So we do have some archaeological information, but nothing in the way of being large buildings. So that's Thyatira. All right, this, of all of the letters, it's magnificent. The way that John is going to weave the Old Testament text and the message, not just the text, but the message that comes from the Old Testament into the context of that city. And if you think, well, Pergamum was woven tightly and so was Sardis, well, this is going to be even more tightly woven. It's really a masterpiece that John is doing. And the nuances of each sentence are speaking to that culture in a way that's quite remarkable. And there's sentences that we don't really know what the context are, but I'm sure there's something there. So this is going to be really cool. We'll go through the letter, and then we'll look at all the ways that these two connect, and it's pretty remarkable. The main issue that's being dealt with is the culture of Thyatira. So the culture of Thyatira is essentially a blue-collar or industrial town. That'll be important in a minute. Think about Youngstown, Ohio. You know, used to be an important city when Goodyear was making tires there. Well, Youngstown today wouldn't exactly be pictured as a strong town. Or maybe Allentown, Pennsylvania, that used to be a steelworking town. Something like that. So blue-collar, industrial, not a financial center. That's Laodicea or Ephesus. You find all the same things that you would in a regular blue-collar town. They find evidence of, we'll talk about this today, trade guilds. Now, trade guilds are a very important part of the social fabric and the community of the people of Thyatira. Now, a guild is an association of workers in a particular skill that are contractors. That differs from a union. They seem to be about the same. A union is an organization of people that are employed. So the United Auto Workers are a group of employees that work for Ford or GM or whomever. A trade guild is like the Screen Actors Guild. You're an actor. You're never really employed by one particular studio. You contract out. Yet, if you want to be an actor in Hollywood, how important is it that you join that trade guild? Well, they're not going to let you. They're not going to give you any work if you're not part of the Screen Actors Guild. You have to be part of it. It's a very powerful organization, and they control, essentially, the economics in a way. Scholars have noted that they think that there are more guilds in Thyatira than any other town in Asia Minor. So let's go through at least the list that they found. And the way they find this is inscriptions, where they're talking about the guild, the leatherworker guild. And, some inscriptions are talking about they had a guild leader that was very important. And so they're writing about all the things that he did for the guild. Or maybe they're elevating their guild god. Each guild has a god that you follow. So they find inscriptions all over the place. And that's how they know that the guilds, there's so many guilds. So we have this: wool workers, weavers, tailors, linen workers, leather workers, shoemakers, bakers, dye makers. Dye makers, we'll look at that in a little bit. Slave merchants, potters. I think I left potters off your list, and I don't know how I did that, but I left potters off. That'll be your one fill in the blank for your sheet. Potters, blacksmiths, and then bronze smiths. And the bronze is really what made Thyatira famous. There's even a Greek word that John uses. The word is kolkalabanos, and they think that that's actually a special type of bronze that was made there in Thyatira. So bronze is a very important aspect within Thyatira. But these are all guilds that they found, at least mentioned inscription-wise. And of course, you could see that's just an industrial town. Okay, so why are guilds important? We haven't talked about this yet. First of all, every guild must be approved by the Roman Senate. This creates a structure, a social fabric within the community. You can't get work unless you're part of a guild. They're that important. Plus, they create your community. It's, just like, so I grew up near Cleveland, Ohio, and there's a town near Cleveland called Parma. Parma was where you found all of the auto workers. There were GM plants and foundries and all of that. Well, everybody in Parma belonged to a union. They all had their union jackets. They all had a union cap. They played on union softball leagues. They were on union bowling leagues. Your whole life was consumed with that union. And if you said to that union, hey, I don't want to be part of you, what happens to your livelihood? Well, it's loyalty, right? You will get union leaders or people who will say, we're not going to let you participate like everyone else unless you show us loyalty to the group. So very much your economics in the city are going to be tied to some kind of guild. Now the part, and this is where it really starts to become difficult if you convert to Christianity, is that each guild has a guild god. And this would become your personal god. So if you're a leather worker and you have a guild god, you might have that idol in your household. That becomes like a personal god to you. The city will have a god as well. We'll see that in a minute, but each guild within that. One thing to remember about all these gods in Asia or in the Roman Empire is they're not jealous if you worship somebody else. So Zeus thinks it's perfectly fine if you go to a Dionysian festival, and Dionysus doesn't care if you worship Artemis because you're pregnant, and Artemis doesn't care if you worship the imperial cult. It doesn't matter. There's no sense within these gods that you have to have any allegiance to them. But that's not the case, of course, with our God, who the very first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me, and I am a jealous God. So Can you be part of a guild? Can you engage in guild lifestyle if you're a Christian? And if you don't, what happens to your family in the economics? Are you allowed to buy and sell in the marketplace if you're not supporting your guild? Would be a good question in the time of Revelation. The last piece to this is that there were a couple guilds that they found where the God of Israel is the guild god. So for instance, those who engage in purple dye, and we'll talk purple dye in a minute, often had the Jewish God as their guild god. And of course, because in the Roman Empire, Judaism was an authorized religion, it didn't offend the Romans that you would have that god as your guild god. So purple dye and stonecutters. So you can imagine purple dye was a very popular skill within the Jewish community. You wouldn't have to go into being part of a guild and worshiping another god. Okay, that'll play in a minute when we get a little further down. You'll see that in the text how that shows up. All right, so that's guilds. Now, here's the other problem with guilds. Something called a guild feast. These were very popular in the ancient world. And again, it's just like, hey, on Friday night, all the union guys go out drinking. And you're expected, if you're part of that, to go out with them. Yeah, I had a commanding officer one time in the Marine Corps that Friday night, you were expected to be at that officers club drinking beer. And if you weren't, somehow your loyalty to the group was called into question. Now it's not as bad today as it used to be, but years ago, that was a very strong way to show your loyalty. You go party with the group. And of course, that can cause issues for those people who don't want to go do that. All right, the guild feast. You would gather each week, maybe in the temple of the god or some kind of banquet hall, and you would gather to worship your guild god for providing all of the stuff that the god is providing for your work, to thank the god for the provisions that you're getting. So you'd gather together to worship the guild god. And of course, what you're going to do is you're going to make sacrifices to the guild god. Meat in the ancient world, or in that first century, it's a rarity. We can't imagine. You know, it wasn't that long ago that FDR made the statement about a chicken in every pot. Like that was a big deal, that every household could have access to meat. Well, now Bonnie calls me yesterday from the grocery store. What protein unit would you like tonight for dinner? The options are endless. Well, I'd like beef, but now we have to select what type of, I don't think we realize with our access to meat today, how easy it is, how difficult it was back then to have meat regularly. Well, the guilds in their community would provide you meat. And of course, it's meat that's been sacrificed to an idol. The guild banquet hall would have something called a triclinium or a cline. A cline is a couch to recline on. A triclinium is a three-sided couch. So a banquet hall would have a three-sided couch. We've seen this before. A couple weeks ago, we went to Pergamum, and we noted that in the Dionysus worship, you would worship, the banquet hall was called a triclinium. So it's a three-sided couch. 1, 2, 3 sides. And then you would lie down on your left hand and you would eat the meat sacrificed to an idol, and drink wine. So you get all of the stuff that goes along with these drinking a lot of wine. And of course, the same thing would happen at the guild feast. They're always in a very, it's a banquet and festive type celebration. So you worship your god, you sacrifice meat to the idol, you are on a triclinium or a cline, or a couch that you would then drink your wine, and there attested to that the guild feast would regularly devolve into drunkenness and sexual immorality. Now just think about that for a minute, but where have we seen meat sacrificed to idols and sexual immorality before? Well, in our letter to Pergamum, we saw the same thing. Now that, at least we can connect it in Pergamum to the worship of Dionysus, but that's also guild feast. It's the same type of thing. So again, ask yourself, or at least feel the tension. You decide that you're going to become a Christian living in Thyatira, but you're a potter, you're a leather worker, you're a blacksmith. That group, that guild is going to insist that you keep coming to their guild feasts if you want to be part of the club. So what do? Because if you don't go to the guild feast, you now get excluded from the economic life of the city. And that becomes that's such a powerful motivation to maintain your position in a group and to not move into another group that might hurt your economic situation, your family, or the whole social structure that you've built around your life. And you know, that's been around, it's still around today. People use economic punishment when someone doesn't go along with the group. It's very real today, just as it was back then. So please feel the tension of what it would be like to live in Thyatira, to be part of a guild, and then become a Christian that says, oh no, now I can't go do this anymore. I can't be part of your guild celebration. That becomes a very powerful way to keep people intentionally or unintentionally in the same group. Okay, now, just so you know, this is, if you want to turn to Acts 15, now you have to listen to the words of Acts 15. Acts 15 is what we call the Council of Jerusalem. Paul and Peter and Barnabas are out engaging the world, and they're realizing that Gentiles are now coming into this movement, Judaism, where they worship the Messiah Jesus. And now you have a question, well, what do we do with these Gentiles? And so this whole chapter 15 is, we've got a problem, particularly when you're demanding that males become circumcised in order to be part of this new covenant. And of course, a 45-year-old male who's may be deciding whether they want to join your group or not may balk at the idea of having a circumcision at 45. They might say, honey, go ahead and you can worship that God, I'll stay home. It becomes a stumbling block to somebody entering the group. And this is exactly what they're trying to solve. How do we remove enough barriers to allow the Gentiles in? So here's what they say. Verse 19, it is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. There's the issue. We've got too many things in the way that are stopping them from turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them, and watch what they're going to tell them, abstain from food polluted by idols and from sexual immorality. Now that's right out of the guild feast. Now, it's also the Noahide covenant, the covenant with Noah, that says, don't eat meat with blood in it. So from meat of strangled animals and from blood. But I just want you to hear how that food sacrificed to idols and sexual immorality is right up the alley of a guild feast. So scholars, as soon as you start talking about guild feasts, scholars will point to this verse and say, this is exactly part of the issue that Acts 15 is dealing with. Look, we're not going to put too many barriers on you to get it to come into this group called Christianity, but there are going to be some things that you have to abstain from. And of course, again, if your whole livelihood is built around a guild, well, that's going to become difficult for you. Okay, so we can connect the guild to Acts 15. All right, so you have guilds. Another thing or famous item that you find at Thyatira is a famous Sybil. called Sambation. Now, a Sybil is a prophetess. So a prophetess, we would say maybe like a fortune teller. It's normally a woman, and the idea is you're connecting to the god of the underworld, Apollo. So you're going to get words from the underworld that are going to give you clues to the future or secrets, and they called them deep secrets. They're not word that comes from on high, they're word that comes up from below. I know at Didyma, what they found in the chamber in the temple, and the reason that there's a temple there is apparently there's some noxious gas that leaks up out of the ground, like a natural seeping gas, and that would kind of put the prophetess in a little bit of a delirium, and she'd have visions and things like that. So clearly people believed in him. Point is, at Thyatira, they have a famous Sybil. Now, the thing that made her unique is that she's Jewish. And so their thought is they must have had a group of people at Thyatira that were Jewish that started to stray from the God of Judaism. So just like today, you have Jews that don't practice Judaism, but they might be Buddhists or practice another religion. So they think that there is a group here in Thyatira led by a woman who's a Jewish Sybil, and she might be connecting ideas from their scripture, the Old Testament, to things that are happening today. And you could see how confusing that would be for a Gentile to come in, because you believe, hey, if she's Jewish, she knows this Jewish God, but now she's also practicing the arts of getting words from Apollo. So who knows where she got her words. But this is another piece that's going to enter the text, but it comes from that famous Sybil there in Thyatira. All right, next point. Purple dye. So I mentioned one of the guilds is dyers, and one of the most important guilds is purple dye. And of course, the purple dye guild often would have the god of Israel as their guild god. We haven't really talked about this, but in the first century, the Roman society was structured in a very rigid class system. And within that Roman class system, slaves at the bottom, emperor and senators at the top. Within that class structure, you were allowed to wear certain colors that would tell people what your rank is in society. So the color purple was only allowed to be worn by the emperor, a senator, or an equestrian. And as you move from emperor, senator to equestrian, the amount of purple would change. So purple ended up becoming a Roman monopoly under Nero. The production of purple is connected with the imperial cult because it's only those people in Roman society that are allowed to wear the color purple. Just like today, purple is seen as a royal color. Well, that comes from years of the monopoly of the Roman Empire on who can wear purple. Now, generally, purple is made from seashells, but there's a variant of purple called Turkish red, and it comes from an oak tree, and that oak tree is found around Thyatira. So Thyatira becomes a place where you make purple dye and make clothes of purple. But who can you sell those clothes to? Who do you have to distribute to? Well, you can only distribute to 3 classes of people within Roman society. So we go to Acts 16. So if you had your Bible open to Acts 15, you can turn to one more chapter. We find a connection with this purple dyeing industry. So Paul is at the city of Philippi. Philippi, so someone just sent in a question. What was meant by equestrian? The way that this class structure was set up was you had to have a certain amount of money, a certain amount of sesterces in the bank that you could prove your wealth. So I think, and if my memory serves me, the number 400,000 sticks out. Only the wealthiest in the class. When we get to Ephesus, we'll talk about this because there's a cultural practice of passing down wealth to your kids. And if you're in an equestrian class and you have too many children and your wealth would be divided, then you leave them in a lower class. People didn't want to do that. We'll talk about that when we get to Ephesus. But good question. I'll have to send out a little chart of the Roman class system so you'll understand. But all they're doing is dividing it up by wealth. Okay, but let me show you where it connects. Paul is in a city called Philippi. He writes a letter to the Philippians. Well, you have to know about Philippi. Why? What's going on in Philippi? Well, Philippi is a Roman colony, meaning it's going to be populated by Roman citizens, and Philippi is like the launching point for all of the troops going east. It's a huge military town. So you have Camp Pendleton on the west coast, and then you have Oceanside that would be where the people live. That's the launching point of military out from the west coast. So you have a large population of Roman people of equestrian level up at Philippi. So here's what happens. On the Sabbath day, Paul, on the Sabbath day, went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of them listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia. And what's her job? She's a dealer in purple cloth. So why is Lydia up in Philippi and not down in Thyatira? Because Philippi is where the market is. It's where the Romans, it's a Roman colony, and there's military, equestrian level people there. So she goes up to Philippi as a dealer in purple cloth. Now notice the very next little sentence here. She was a worshiper of God. That means in Acts language, she's a Gentile who worships the God of Israel. If she was Jewish, it would say she was Jewish. Remember that in the purple dyeing guild, you can have the God of Israel as your guild god. So this appears to be someone who dealt in purple, who then became a worshiper of God. And now as she meets Paul, Paul's going to engage her in a discussion of the Messiah, the Lord then opens her heart. But I just want to show you how Thyatira and purple connect in the book of Acts. Again, it makes sense when you start to see all these things connecting throughout the text and you think, okay, that gives me relief that my Bible makes sense. All right, changing topics again. We got to get to the letter, but these are all like different things that will show up inside the letter. The gods of Thyatira. So the main god in Sardis was Kibbalah, big female Mother Earth goddess. The main gods in Pergamum, well, there's a whole bunch of them, but you have the Zeus altar, you have Asclepius that was very famous, Athena, and then, of course, the emperor himself. Well, Thyatira has some rather obscure gods. The first one is a god called Tyrimnos. He comes from more of central Turkey. So as he meets the Romans and the Greeks, he takes on the name Apollo Tyrimnos. He's the sun. He's often seen riding a horseback with a battle axe, carrying a battle axe. So he's a hero that's going to come do battle. And you can imagine in a town that's set up like a military outpost, he becomes the perfect god for them. He is also, he's the son of Zeus. Now this becomes important. He's the son of Zeus. A second god, and this is very obscure and it never took hold, is Domitian and his wife, Domitia. He gave her his same name but put it in feminine form. Domitian had a son who died at a very early age. So he had a child, the child died, and what Domitian did was he decided he was going to deify his child, make his child into a god. So the deified child of Domitian, they don't even know his name, becomes a god, I'll show you a coin in a minute, of Thyatira. So you have the son of Zeus and the son of Domitian, who also thinks himself as a god. Both gods of the city are sons of a god. Have you heard of that before? Let me go. Here's the coin. So one side of the coin, you have the Domitian. On your right-hand side of the screen is the picture of his son, the deified son of Domitian. And let me show you a closer up because this is instructive on first century symbolism. How do you tell the world through a coin, that's your public service announcement, who is deity, right? Well, the first thing you notice is if you look at the globe that he's sitting on, in ancient times, you create a globe and it has a cross on it. There's a cross section. That's where the sun, the path of the sun, meets the path of the zodiac. When we looked at the god Mithra, Mithra is shown on top of a globe that has a cross, just like that. And it basically means who's controlling the central point of the cosmos. Well, in this case, the coin, the propaganda is Domitian's son. So the sun is seated on the globe, the central point of the universe, and notice how many stars he has next to him. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Who holds the 7 stars? If you have an emperor promoting the propaganda that his son holds the 7 stars, and then John shows up and says, oh, no, no, these are the words of the one who holds the 7 stars. That's that whole idea of who controls the cosmos. The 7 stars being the 7 bodies that move between the Milky Way and Earth as the center. So anyways, that speaks right into that culture. We've seen those 7 stars or mentions of it multiple times. But now you can see how apparently Domitian's son never caught on. The propaganda didn't catch on. But Thyatira minted a coin showing Domitian's son. There's another coin from maybe 100 years later that is the same. It's the same thing. It's a goddess holding up Domitian's son to be worshipped. That comes out of Thyatira. Okay, so check this out. You have 2 gods of the city. Both of them are called Son of God. Now, in the book of Revelation, the phrase Son of God is only used 1 time. Now, where do you assume, based on 8 weeks of doing this, where would you assume that the phrase Son of God shows up in the book of Revelation? Well, it shows up in the letter to Thyatira. To the angel of the church in Thyatira write, these are the words of the Son of God. Now, why does John include Son of God in Thyatira? Because and I think the emphasis is not Son of God. The emphasis are these are the words of the Son of God. Not those 2 gods that you worship. These words are the words of the Son of God. It's again, that just blows my mind when you see how pointed John's references are to the city. He doesn't do that in Laodicea. He doesn't do it in Sardis. He doesn't do it in Pergamum. He uses what speaks to that culture there in Thyatira. Okay, so let's go through. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read through the entire letter to Thyatira. Just straight through. I'm not going to comment on it. Then we're going to go back and we're going to comment on each sentence. When we comment on the verse, we want to look at where's the Old Testament text, where's the context of the city, and how is John weaving them together? Okay, so starting with Revelation 2, verse 18. To the angel of the church in Thyatira write, these are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like blazing fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. I know your deeds, your love and faith, your service and perseverance, and that you are now doing more than you did at first. Verse 20, nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet. By her teaching misleads my servants into sexual immorality and eating food sacrificed to idols. I have given her time to repent of her immorality, but she is unwilling. So I will cast her on a bed of suffering, and I will make those who commit adultery with her suffer intensely, unless they repent of her ways. I will strike her children dead. Then all the churches will know that I am he who searches hearts and minds, and I will repay each according to your deeds. Verse 24, now I say to the rest of you in Thyatira, you who do not hold to her teaching and have not learned Satan's so-called deep secrets, I will not impose any other burden on you except to hold on to what you have until I come. Final. To the one who's victorious and does my will to the end, I will give authority over the nations. That one will rule them with an iron scepter and dash them to pieces like pottery, just as I have received authority from my Father. I will also give that one the morning star. Whoever has ears, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Okay, that's the letter. Now, hopefully, if I did my job correctly by showing you the culture of the letter first, you would have been picking up on things. You could pick up on references. So let's walk through them. This is going to be our text to context. Let's go back through the letter and talk through its amazing details, how John's weaving this together. So, to the angel of the church in Thyatira write, these are the words of the Son of God. Now, right there, we've already talked about this. You have the two gods of the city, which are both sons of a god, or at least in Domitian's case, he's declaring that his son is a son of God. But where's John getting that text? Think about what text in the Old Testament speaks of the Son of God. Well, Psalm 2, verse 7. So Psalm 2 is a royal messianic psalm. It says, I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Now, the whole idea of Psalm 2 is there's a king on the throne, and God is declaring that you are my son now today, and you are going to eventually, you'll see, reign over the nations. So Psalm 2, John pulls that right in about having authority from the Father. Okay, let's go back. These are the words of the Son of God, whose eyes are like blazing fire and whose feet are like burnished bronze. Well, what does that sound like? What is Thyatira famous for? Well, Thyatira is famous for their bronze making, called kol kalabanos, a very important bronze in that time. And you can imagine if you have a city just like a city that's a steelworking city, there's smokestacks and there's smoke rising up in the air and there's fires, and that's exactly what is happening in Thyatira as everybody's making the bronze. But where does John get his material from? Well, the Old Testament, of course. So he gets it from Daniel 10, verse 5 and 6. So Daniel 10, I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen, with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like topaz, his face like lightning, his eyes like flaming torches. His arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze. So John's pulling from Daniel 10. He's not, but it fits the culture of Thyatira. Okay, let's keep going. I know your deeds, your love and faith, your servants and perseverance. Service and perseverance. Now think about a union or a hardworking blue-collar town. Does service and perseverance sound like a hardworking town? Yes, it speaks right to that. You don't have a life of ease. Every day is difficult work. So your service and perseverance, and that you are now doing more than you did at first. Next, nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel. Now, who's he referring to? Well, everything points to that Sybil. That Sybil who's getting words from the god who lives in the underworld and who's confusing everybody. She calls herself a prophet. Her teaching misleads my servants into sexual immorality and eating food sacrificed to idols. So is it possible the Sybil there, John refers to as Jezebel, we'll get that in a minute, but is she teaching people, don't worry about your guild. Don't worry about that guild god. Don't worry about the meat sacrificed to idols. Jesus will forgive you. Go ahead. It doesn't really matter. Keep engaging in that. So is it possible that she's adding confusion to the people and their practices within the guilds? So first of all, he's got a prophetess in the town, plus he's got the guild feast, sexual immorality, eating food sacrificed to idols. Now, what about Jezebel? Where does she come from? Where does that name come from? Well, the Old Testament. So Jezebel is the wife, non-Jewish wife, of the king Ahab. Now Ahab, according to the Bible, did evil in the eyes of God. So it says, verse 31, he not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. So here's a wife, just like Solomon brought in wives that got Solomon to worship other gods. You have Ahab bringing in a wife from another culture, and she brings in her Baal worship. Here's another verse from 1 Kings. There was, and this basically describes Ahab, there was never anyone like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, and who's he urged on by? His wife Jezebel. So he connects something from the Old Testament, Baal worship, to what's going on in Thyatira by calling her Jezebel. Now, it gets better. Oh, wait, there's more. I have given her time to repent of her immorality, but she is unwilling. This next sentence is genius. I will cast her on a bed of suffering. Now, the heck does that mean? Well, first of all, how does Jezebel die in the Old Testament? Does anybody know? Think about that for a minute. How did Jezebel die? Well, she was thrown down from a window. So she's cast down. So he uses the way Jezebel died, and then that word for bed is kleine. It's the guild feast couch. It's the couch that you recline on when you're at the guild feast. So he connects the guild feast through the use of the word kleine with the same way that Jezebel died. She was cast down from a window. So I will cast her on a bed of suffering, a kleine of suffering. And I will make those who commit adultery with her suffer intensely. What do you do on a kleine at a guild feast? You engage in sexual immorality. It's genius how he's tying these things together. So it's guild and it's Jezebel. exact the way that Jezebel died, unless they repent of their ways. Now, next sentence, I will strike her children dead. Why even put that sentence in there? What happened to Jezebel's children in the Old Testament? They were all killed because you had a wicked king and a wicked queen, and you get to kings and they go and they kill all their sons. So he's bringing that right out of the Old Testament. Okay. Now this next sentence. Then all the churches will know that I am he who searches hearts and minds, and I will repay each of you according to your deeds. Now, where in the Bible does it talk about God searching hearts and minds? Well, if you look at the sheet I sent you, you'll know immediately what I'm talking about. One area is Psalm 139. You know Psalm 139. Search me, O Lord, and know my heart. Test me and know all my anxious thoughts. That's one place where God searches. But what he's quoting here is almost a direct quote of Jeremiah 17:10. So Jeremiah 17:10. And notice in Jeremiah, I, Yahweh, search the heart and examine the mind. And so when John takes those words in the mouth of Jesus, he turns them to I, Jesus, search the hearts and examine the mind. To reward each person according to their conduct, according to what their deeds deserve. Now, what's the point in putting that in there? Why put that sentence in there? The context of Jeremiah 17:10, and this is one that would, if you know the context of Jeremiah, it's going to speak into Thyatira, is for those who are in charge. Think Jezebel, or think if you have influence over somebody and you think you can get away with doing things that are evil, call it a misuse of authority. You think you're getting away with a misuse of authority? No, you're not. Because God is a God who searches hearts and minds, and he repays everybody. Part of what was happening in Jeremiah was the religious leaders were saying, we're safe. See, we worship the Jewish God. He's not going to punish us. And Jeremiah shows up and says, oh yeah? God searches hearts and minds. Don't misuse your power, because you will be held accountable too. So it's very much of it's a justice issue that Jeremiah is speaking of. Okay, let's keep going, because it's just, now I say to the rest of you in Thyatira, to you who do not hold to her teaching and have not learned Satan's so-called deep secrets. Well, where did we find the idea of deep secrets? Well, it comes from Jezebel, right? It comes from the idea that your Jezebel is, or I'm not Jezebel, the Sambation, the Sybil. She's going down to get word from Apollo, the god of the underworld. Well, in Christianity, who's the god of the underworld? Satan. So John's just intermixing what the belief system is that comes from that first century Christian sect. Now look at the next sentence. I will not impose on any other burden. Does that speak to a working class culture? I'm not going to impose any other burden. Hold on, though, to what you have until I come. Next. 26. To the one who's victorious and does my will to the end, I will give you authority over the nations. Now, if you live in Thyatira, the last thing you think you're ever going to get is authority over the nations. Period. You're the smallest city. You don't have any power. And that is such a deep message of the New Testament, right? The first will be last, the last will be first. So if you find yourself in a position where you have no power, hang on. Don't disobey me, because you will eventually, the kingdom of God will flip the script of this world. The last will become first. The first will become last. Okay. I will give the authority to rule over the nations. Now look at what he's going to quote. That one will rule over them with an iron scepter and dash them to pieces like pottery. Now, does iron scepter and pottery sound like Thyatira? Yeah, you have blacksmiths and you have pottery makers. Just as I have received authority from my father, which would be the authority of Tyrimnos comes from Zeus, his father. The authority of Domitian's son comes from his father. So he's intermixing that. But the quote comes from Psalm 2 again. So we have to go back to Psalm 2. He started this letter with Psalm 2. He's going to finish the letter with Psalm 2. And when we go back to Psalm 2, verses 8 and 9, ask me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. I will give you authority over the nations. This is exactly what Psalm 2 says. Verse 9, you will break them with a rod of iron. Also sometimes interpreted, rule them with a rod of iron. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. So again, when things look like they're lost, you're going to be the one who's last. Jesus says, no, 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 the tables are turned. In the kingdom of God, the last shall be first, the first shall be last. Okay, back to this. And here's where he's really going to sink the knife in, because this is so obscure. Verse 28, I will also give that one the morning star. Now, this one's almost impossible to pick up. But it comes from the book of Numbers, chapter 24. Now, 2 weeks ago, we were in the book of Numbers, chapter 24, because this quote is coming from a guy, a prophet named Balaam, who taught Balak to teach the Israelites to sin and commit sexual immorality and eat meat sacrificed to idols. That was 2 weeks ago in Pergamum. So by putting in a sentence about the morning star, you bring in the whole Balaam and Balak story again. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. So he's seeing something off in the future. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. That's the Messiah. But he puts one little sentence in that brings the whole idea of Balaam and Balak, who did the same thing at Pergamum, is referenced. It's just amazing. So the star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. Well, basically the same thing he's saying right there. So you've not only got Jezebel, you've got Daniel, you've got Jeremiah and Justice, you've got the book of Numbers and Balaam and sexual immorality and eating meat sacrificed to idols. Almost every single sentence in here has some dual reference happening where he's connecting both sides. It's actually, this letter takes a little bit of time to let all this sink in, because you have to really know something about the culture. But man, when it does, it's just absolutely amazing how John is weaving all of this together. So the question is this the God that has authority? Is this the one that holds the 7 stars? Is this the Son who's going to receive authority from the Father? No way, says Jesus. And you can just think of the propaganda. If you had a child who died and you decide to tell the world that it's a God, and you can understand why it never took hold, but Domitian is at least attempting it. Okay, that's Thyatira. God willing, I did my job well enough to show you the culture and then to see where that culture and the old text of the Old Testament sinks in. It takes a little bit of work, but once you start seeing it, man, it's really amazing what John is doing, how he's weaving that together. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's the question that goes to every single letter that John's writing, all of those little letters to the cities. How much of that Old Testament are you going to pick up? Well, initially 0. So you have to go to somebody who's a God-fearer. God-fearer is a Gentile who knows and worships the God of Israel. So for instance, Lydia, being in purple dye, would have exposure to the God of Israel, or you have to find a Jew. And it forces, and this is what the genius of what John's doing, is it forces the community to come together to talk about these references. Why does John reference Jezebel, or why does John reference Jeremiah? And what's the interpretation of the day that helps us understand something about the way we have to live? So you're right. The Gentiles would be like, what are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense, except they would get all the cultural references. So that part, but it's really amazing what John does. The word that's there for angel can also mean messenger. And angels are messengers. So there's no doubt that an angel can bring a message. So scholars don't really know. Does that mean you're assigning a particular angel to a church? Or because in the Daniel quote, there's a particular angel that's doing battle who shows up. So is it possible that John's reading into that there's a particular angel for Thyatira? But scholars just don't know, because you could go both ways. It's probably somewhere deep inside this whole ambiguously written letter. You know, some people get upset because the Bible's often quite ambiguous, but part of the genius of having something ambiguous is how many different cultures can read it and get something out of it. And that's really a strength rather than a weakness, even though us Westerners, we love clearly written statements, and we hate the ambiguity that comes along with a God that we can't always understand why he's doing things or how he works. You know, so here's another thing that you learn by studying these letters, and I hope you can see it. We tend to think in our modern context, because most people who grow up in America anyways, they've heard of Jesus and they know the concept of God because it's been around for 2,000 years and it's enculturated where we live. If you show up to Thyatira and say, I worship the Son of God, what are they going to say? Yeah, so what? So do I. Well, and you go to Pergamum and you say, well, my God is a healer. And they say, yeah, so what? So is my God. And what this forces you to do is to dig to a level to say, what was it about those first Christians that hit that world hard, that wasn't simply an intellectual argument about who God is or how I can prove that the Bible's correct? That's a modern day of going about it. How do you tell a culture that believes all the same things you do about their gods that your God is different? You love your neighbor. You let the slave eat first. You don't hold this Roman power structure of the society over somebody else. And that's how, even today, how do you speak to a world that wants to argue with you about God? You simply show them what God looks like when it shows up in the world. So it's much more of the way that they changed the world was not through smart arguments, as positive as those are and as helpful as they can be. It was through, come down to our house church. And when the people leave the dinner, they say, whoa, wait a minute. The slaves ate first? Nobody got drunk? They weren't swearing at each other? They were actually nice and uplifting? They praised God they blessed everybody that was there? That's a totally different culture than the Asian culture that is selfish and wants to get drunk and doesn't adhere to any moral standards. So I just want to, that's such an important piece, because you can't argue with a Greek about facts about Jesus. You have to show him the love of Jesus, and that can change somebody's heart. Anyways, it's a powerful way. You have to think about that for a little bit. How did they change the world? It wasn't through argument about whose God is right. It was simply about showing the love of Jesus in a world and you flip the script upside down. That catches people's attention.